Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, we discuss the Carlos Correa deal falling through, what happened, how we feel, and what it means for the short and long-term future. As always, we close out the show answering your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcast, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And listen, you know where we're starting this one off today, folks. The Mets deal with Carlos Correa has fallen through. He ends up signing a 6-year deal with a lot of different layers with the Minnesota Twins. So Correa going back to the Twins, his offseason started signing with the Giants, moved to the Mets after plenty of issues with a physical. He ends up back in Minnesota. So, Joe, let's bring you in right away here. I mean, this was something that dragged on as long as we've ever seen with a physical issue in baseball, it felt like. There were a lot of different layers talked through of how to make this deal work to protect both sides. But at the end of the day, Carlos Correa will not be a New York Met.
It's obviously a disappointing day. I mean, there's no other way to put it. We were excited about the prospects of Carlos Correa batting second, batting fifth. Like, we were talking about this episode was going to be, fantasizing what the lineup could look like with Correa in it. And now he's a Minnesota Twin. And, obviously everyone knows what happened with the physical. The Mets had a problem with the surgically repaired ankle that has the plate in there. And I'm just going to say it based on reporting from John Heyman, which I'm sure there's going to be more information still to come out. But based on what I read and how I understood it, it didn't sound to me like the Mets really wanted Carlos Correa after they saw the physical. Yes, they were, quote unquote, at the 6 years, $157 million, which obviously is $43 million short of what the Twins gave him. But supposedly, according to Heyman, the Mets wanted Correa to take a physical every year. So were they looking at it essentially as 6 one-year deals and then some vesting options behind it? That doesn't sound like a team that's overly motivated to make something happen, which all that tells me is the Mets doctors think that this ankle is deteriorating quickly. And you mentioned on the show last week that, it's everyone believes he's going to be fine for 5 years. Maybe the Mets didn't think he was going to be fine for 5 years. And, obviously only time will tell if that's right or wrong. But, while disappointing, I think you can also look at it from the other side of the Mets are being, firm in what they believe medically. We saw it with on an obviously much smaller level, but with a first-round pick in Kumar Rocker, they backed out of that due to medicals. Correa, when, everything fell apart with the Giants, it was a physical. We didn't really talk about, what if the Mets flunk him too? We were just like, oh, the Giants got cold feet or something weird happened there. And turns out the Mets had the same problem. And, it's a credit, despite how much money Steve Cohen has and his strong desire to win, he's not going to let that completely override a potential bad business decision.
And Joe, kind of to piggyback off of what you're saying, he allowed the baseball people, which the medical staff is very much included in the baseball people of this, to do their job, and rather than interfering and saying, I want the player no matter what, always go further than the competition, which was the Minnesota Twins, because we know both sides of this. We know Correa was ecstatic to be a New York Met, judging by his reaction of tackling Scott Boras. And we saw the baby wearing the I Love New York shirt, or all the little signs. And we know Steve Cohen, with how public he went with his excitement over this as well, saying this is a bat that puts them over the top, that both sides were very interested in making this work. But you always forget the third side that isn't emotion, it's logic, right? The Correa side was a lot of emotion. The Steve Cohen side was a lot of emotion. The third party in this was logic. And, some people listening to this might say, hey, we're being Mets homers, or we're siding with the team, or whatever they want to call it. Let me make this clear. I would love to watch Carlos Correa in a New York Met uniform this year. I would like to watch him in a New York Met uniform for a couple of years. If the medical side of this said it was unlikely that he would complete more than 60% or whatever it was of the deal, and that the risk was massive. You have to trust that opinion when all that money is on the line. So time will always tell with these situations, and we're going to get into what not having this money on the books for the next 10 plus years or whatever it could have been could impact the Mets in an offseason where, you have somebody like Ohtani, you have somebody like Machado being on the market. We'll get to that. But let's just break down, for those that don't know, what the Twins deal looks like, because this is a pretty complicated situation, right? Correa ultimately gets the 6-year deal from the Twins. The 6 years are fully guaranteed. It's $200 million over 6 years. That extra $70 million is over 4 vesting years with the Twins. So different things can activate this contract becoming ultimately a 10-year, $270 million deal, which is not too far off of what the Twins were reportedly rumored to offer in the beginning of the offseason of 10 years, $285 million. He also gets a no full trade clause in this Twins deal, which is pretty massive situation. The 7 to 10 years per Heyman vest with 575 plate appearances in year 7, 550 in year 8, 525 and 502 in those final years. So essentially, Correa has to play to have those years vest and become guaranteed. Correa, in a sense, I never like to say told on himself or doesn't have confidence in himself, but Joe, Correa chose the 6 years of more guaranteed money rather than the place he wanted to be with the Mets for less money, while the Mets also would have given him a chance to have the years beyond that pending him pass a physical. So basically what he's saying is, I need to take every last guaranteed dollar I can over the last half decade plus, because beyond that, nothing is guaranteed with his health.
It's you really think now, like, did he really want to be with the Mets, or did he want to be with the Mets because it was 12 years and $315 million?
It makes things a lot easier.
That make it easy to be anywhere, really. I can't blame him. Look, if I were Carlos Correa right now, and let's say what Heyman is saying is true, how the Mets were trying to structure that deal, I would not have even considered signing with the Mets, where I have to, obviously he knows there's a plate in his ankle. He's not naive about that, but he believes he's fine. He hasn't missed time due to it. I think he probably regrets saying what he did after he got tagged on it in September and said that it vibrated and he was numb. Like, saying that publicly, he might have some regret there. But, the Twins were willing to guarantee money and the Mets weren't. And I really think when it comes down to brass tacks, it's often that simple in pro sports.
It really is. I mean, Correa got the deal he's been looking for, right? The deal worth mega money that, changes obviously your life and it gives you a home for the next half decade plus, all of those things. And, at the end of the day, I think this is kind of the point of the podcast where, before we turn the page, I'll ask one funny one, Joe, because then we're going to turn the page and it's going to be all business and we're going to look at this Mets team and the what now of this offseason, the what now of next offseason, and of course this roster. But I have a couple choices for you of what your favorite Carlos Correa moment was during his Mets career. And you could write in your own at the end if none of these do it for you. You have one on your own. The one time that Joe, you, enjoyed the news reporting nightlife, aka Joe was awake when this happened, a stunner. Or he was woken up, let's be fair. But Joe was awake when this happened. The news of the deal blowing up the Yankees / Aaron Judge's news conference spotlight. Scott Boras talking about Correa, the Mets, Steve Cohen at the Yankees Carlos Rodon news conference. The vision of Carlos Correa tackling Scott Boras in a San Francisco hotel room to celebrate being a Met, a man in his 60s. The trade Brett Beatty tweets at Joe the second this happened. The last one here, the Instagram post of Kylo Correa wearing his I Love New York shirt.
I'm going to say I'll go with me being awake, because
that's absolutely mine. The fact that I woke up to you telling me the news really says it all.
Yeah, I simply am not awake at that time. It was just a weird thing that happened that just woke up. couldn't fall back asleep easily. And it just so happened that the Mets agreed to a deal with Carlos Correa while Steve Cohen's sipping martinis in Hawaii and talking about it. And, I mean, while we're on the fun subject, like, I hope Steve Cohen learned a little bit of a lesson there. Maybe you shouldn't be talking on the record publicly about things. Yeah. Drinking and dealing can maybe be okay, but let's just
in fantasy football it works. In $300 million contracts, it does not.
Just keep the public comments away until things are official. I think it's a lesson learned for him, but it was a wild 3 hours of me being awake from 2:30 to 5 a.m. and just how many people are on Twitter at that time. I had no clue. Like, I was tweeting and getting mentions like it was the middle of the day. So I just live by a different time schedule than everyone else in the world, apparently, because Twitter was really hot during the overnights there.
All right. Yeah, I don't even know what mine is, to be honest with you. Definitely the Yankees side of it was very funny because there's no way that's why this was done. But the fact that it became such a subject was very, very enjoyable. So I do want to turn the page to really what are the ramifications of this, Joe? Because when they got Correa, I think our attitude changed. I think a lot of people's attitude changed. This season became the expectations were for this team to reach the World Series, right? And I think when you look at the Mets, you can have different conversations in a vacuum. One, in my personal opinion, the Mets go into this upcoming season as a much better team than last year. If you are counting on Justin Verlander to pitch more than Jacob deGrom did, if you are looking at the bullpen that has some high-end pieces in it now, along with the return of Edwin Diaz, if you are expecting a boost from some young talent, which we are, whether that is Brett Beatty, whether that is Francisco Alvarez, whether that is Mark Vientos, one of those three making not a major impact, but some kind of impact, because neither of those three were able to do that last year with basically no opportunity. And the fact that we believe in this rotation from 1 to 5, the depth of this rotation as well. But then you could also have the conversation in a vacuum, Joe, that the lineup's not really different, to be honest with you. And that's even counting the fact that maybe you get a little bit of a boost from one of the young players, but they are running back the same lineup that didn't get it done when it mattered most. So I ask you this, Joe, is there a short-term move that they can make now that can give not a Carlos Correa effect to the lineup, but an improvement? Or do you think that ship is totally sailed as we sit here and get closer and closer to pitchers and catchers reporting?
I mean, I'm not sure what's in the trade market. I mean, I think that's something to look at. I know Brian Reynolds is out there, but I don't know if the prudent move for the Mets is, Correa was deemed a luxury by you, by me, by a lot of people. Steve Cohen said they needed it. Those are his words, but I didn't think they needed Carlos Correa specifically. We talked about needing some more thump in the lineup, and Correa was going to provide that. But it's not like third base is a black hole for the Mets. I mean, Eduardo Escobar was fantastic down the stretch, especially over the last 2 months of the season. And he has a history of being a 20-plus home run guy. So, I mean, Correa hit, 22 home runs, 23 home runs this year, and Escobar hit 20. So, like, the power is possibly comparable. You have the prospects of Brett Beatty. Now, we don't have to talk about Brett Beatty, left fielder. We could talk about Brett Beatty, third baseman again. Opens the door for Ronnie Mauricio. He's a guy that won the MVP down in the Dominican Winter League. So there's not like a Carlos Correa move, I don't think, unless you want to kind of panic and trade something big for Brian Reynolds, which I think would be somewhat ill-advised. And, barring something surprising on the trade market, I would continue to try to improve on the edges. I would go back to our podcast from a month ago before Carlos Correa was even a possibility. Go sign Trey Mancini. Go sign Andrew Chafin. I'm not, a huge proponent of buying up a bullpen, but
go volume.
Go volume. They have a lot of arms, and add a guy like Chafin, add a guy like Mancini, who should be an upgrade over Darren Ruff. And, he could play first base. He could play left field. He could play right field. So you could tinker with some things. And, when we think about this offense, there's no question that it did struggle down the stretch, and that is what matters. So, what I say after this, I understand the most important thing is they didn't get the job done when they needed to down the stretch, and they failed in the playoff series against the Padres. But this is a team that also was 5th in major leagues in runs scored. So it's not an incompetent offense. And I think I'm seeing a lot of that out there, that people are now like, the offense stinks. The offense is no
recency
good.
bias.
Right. And also, too, if you think about down the stretch, a lot of that was about Starling Marte, who missed significant time when he broke the finger. And, we know how big of an impact he was. But it's definitely going to leave a sour taste in people's mouth, understandably, that they're bringing back essentially the same offense that failed down the stretch. But I think once we separate, I think, a little bit from this Correa thing and, we're able to have a measured look at it, I think a lot of people say, the offense feels a little bit light in punch, but it's still a good offense. Definitely one of, the top 10, 5, whatever in baseball. And if they could get Max Scherzer healthy, if they could keep Justin Verlander healthy. We talked about this all last year with DeGrom and Scherzer, and it just never really kind of came together for both of them for an extended period of time. That's what's carrying this team. The team's not going to be carried by the offense. It's going to be carried by the pitching, and the offense just needs to be more consistent throughout the entirety of the season and then in presumably the playoffs.
Joe, let me ask you this. Do you think that we know what happened when the Correa deal got announced, how Cohen came out, I liked it, but puffed out his chest and felt like he was honest that he thought the lineup needed this. Not that they enjoyed the idea of this the lineup needed this was basically how it was worded. Do you think off of that, because sports, we always try to divide emotion and logic, and sometimes they blend together and it's the perfect storm, right? Do you think coming off of this now that Cohen does make a move fueled a little bit by emotion because of what he said publicly and the Correa deal falling through?
I sincerely hope not. I don't want, because that sounds like George Steinbrenner, right? And that's what George had his pros and he had his cons. One of his cons was if he was kind of mad about something or felt emotion, he would use that to drive to make more moves. And I don't want to see Steve Cohen turn into that. I think he's been pragmatic this whole time while aggressive. Like, he's willing to spend, he's willing to give out obviously crazy money. The Mets are still going to have handily the highest payroll in baseball this year. It's still not even going to be particularly close. It's just a little closer than it would have been with Correa. So he's willing to spend, he's willing to do it. I think he's been good about how he's doing it. So I would hope they wouldn't do that, but you could put nothing past them. There's nothing in free agency that I think would warrant that kind of overreaction type of thing. But, do they call the Pirates and say, Brett Beatty's on the table for Brian Reynolds or something, crazy like that? Like, to me, that I hope they're not thinking that way. And I think Billy Epler is the kind of guy that I think has Cohen's ear and would have the ability to hopefully rein him in a little bit. But I guess, we said this too, right when the Correa thing happened. You just never say never with the Mets anymore.
No, you don't. Nothing is off the table. And that kind of leads me to our last talking point here of the what's next, even if it's not for the now, for the next 2-year window. Joe, I wasn't much of a believer that signing Correa would impact a pursuit of a Shohei Ohtani. To be honest with you, I thought they were two separate issues. And Mets have plenty of money coming off the books next year. It didn't feel like signing Correa blocked a blockbuster signing for next year, not trade, signing. But do you think now we live in a world where third base will be wide open after this season, that a guy like Manny Machado could be on the table?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see what Brett Beatty does. You're going to see what Eduardo Escobar does this year. And at that point, I think you'll make your judgment if you need a guy like Machado. But I'm looking at this, like you said, when the agreement with Correa came about, you and I both said it. This doesn't impact their ability to pursue Shohei Ohtani next offseason. But not having Carlos Correa definitely impacts their ability to go after Shohei Ohtani. Steve Cohen has a $315 million down payment already in tow for Shohei Ohtani. And that's going to be a sight to watch next offseason, where you have a motivated Dodgers team who have basically withheld spending this offseason in preparation of a pursuit of Shohei Ohtani this coming offseason. And Steve Cohen and the Mets, who he has more money than anybody else. He just, gets a bit of a black eye from everything that happened with Correa and that falling through. Like, you're saying the over-under at $500 million at this point for Ohtani. I can't see it even being less than that right now, but I think it's not having Correa kind of increases the possibility of Ohtani. And, if third base doesn't work out, there's nothing saying Steve Cohen can't sign Machado too.
It's not insane. It's not off the table. It's really with the Mets, you look at it and go, what places are open and what aren't? We know Francisco Lindor is going to be the shortstop here for a long time. We know Brandon Nimmo is going to be the center fielder. We know Pete Alonso is going to be the first baseman. We don't know a lot beyond that. We think Alvarez will be here a long time at catcher. We think McNeil will be a long time player here at second base. But you're right. Everything else is wide open. And with the signing of Correa, as much as it was exciting for the boost that gave the lineup a gold glove, another gold glove out there on the left side of the infield, it was one of those situations you go, okay, well, he's there for the next 12 years. He's at least holding down the left side of the infield probably for the next 8+, because they're not going to move on from the money anytime before that. Now it just kind of opens up more of the mystery of what impact move could they make? Or like you said, Joe, the most important aspect, what if Brett Beatty just grabs a hold of the reins here and says, good thing you didn't get Carlos Correa, because I'm the first round guy you drafted me to be the third baseman of your long-term future.
And think back to just a year ago, the Houston Astros let Carlos Correa walk out the door, handed the shortstop reins to Jeremy Pena, and he wins World Series MVP. So, sometimes going with the young player is a smart play. And
just let him play.
At the end of the day, let's call it what it is. The Mets didn't want to do this. They had visions of having Carlos Correa. They didn't want to have to turn to Brett Beatty and Eduardo Escobar. They were probably going to trade Eduardo Escobar if they signed
wanted
Carlos
the sure
Correa.
thing.
Correct. They wanted the sure thing. And, now there's risk with what they have at third base. And, that comes with the territory. We talked about this too. Atlanta has played the young kids. You can't be afraid to do it. But one thing that I think is really interesting to weigh here is when you think about this Mets window, it's kind of forever with Steve Cohen's money in a sense, but at the same time,
Joe Burrow quote.
Yeah.
As long as I'm here, the window is open. That's Steve Cohen in baseball. Yes.
But at the same time, Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander are the driving forces of whether this team is going to win now and over the next couple of years. That window is not very big. So I understand why the Mets wanted to really dive in. And unfortunately, they tried and the physical didn't work out and they were able to be rational enough to step back. But it's going to be interesting to see how they pursue, maybe the rest of this offseason is light. Like I said, maybe it's a Mancini, maybe it's an Adam Duvall, maybe they sign another bullpen guy and then they go to battle. And they could be more aggressive at the trade deadline than they were in 2022. And then obviously next offseason. But that window of Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander is this year for sure. Max can opt out after this year. So hypothetically, it's just 1 year with those two guys. But at most, it's 2, maybe 3. So how they balance that window and really making sure they win right now is going to be interesting to follow over the next 12 months.
All right, before we get to everyone's mailbag questions, a quick reminder, you're listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You could watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your shows. Joe, the people, your mentions were flooded before the news came down and then the follow-up after. There's a lot of emotion. I was actually overwhelmingly surprised about I would say about 90% of the replies were either, okay, this had to be really bad, so good thing they didn't do this, or, hey, we keep moving. We got a World Series to win. This is still a really good team. So I actually appreciated that was the consistent thought here. And this first one from Drew Kellenberger, his exact first line was, okay, time to move on. What about pivoting to Chafin and Adam Duvall?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I just mentioned that a couple minutes ago. Maybe it's Mancini, it's Duvall, maybe if they want someone that's capable of playing center field. But one thing that I think is interesting, and I want to ask your opinion on this, actually flip the script here a little bit. I saw a lot of that too, where people are like, okay, because it's been a 3-week thing that everyone I think was just sick of. Do you think fan reaction would be different if the physical was whatever Saturday? It was Christmas Eve. Was it Christmas Eve or whatever? It was a Saturday that the physical was. Something like that.
I think it was the Friday, but essentially Christmas Eve weekend. Yes.
Yeah. Like if you found out the next day that the Mets were out on Correa, would the fan reaction have been worse instead of this 3-week stretch? And how many times I saw on Twitter and around people saying, I'm just sick of this Correa stuff. Just get it over with. And I think people were resigned to the fact that whatever happened. I wonder if it would have been different if it was kind of an instant, like, oh no, Mets are out too.
I think the reaction, if that was the case, would have been by a lot of people using logic. Oh, his ankle is held together by toothpicks and bubble gum, because nobody has back-to-back. He was in San Francisco dressed for the presser when they pulled the plug. And San Francisco took a lot of heat for this. Not a lot of details were made available at the time. The Mets, I think, partially because, not partially, but a little bit of it was how much Cohen wanted the player, worked really hard to protect both sides. Get Correa $157 million guaranteed, and just hope for the best in those 6 years. And then after that, make it an NFL contract where it's pay as you go. And the Twins were willing to go above that $157 million. I mean, for reasons still unknown. It's odd to me, right? And Joe, I get what you're saying. I really do. I do think there would have been a jarring disappointment level because of all those emotions in a 48-hour cycle. But the Giants having that kind of reaction in an offseason where they went all into Aaron Judge, they went all in to get Carlos Correa. They were doing everything possible to land a megastar to turn things around there. The Mets, who will leave no stone unturned to get better at every single avenue and don't care about money at all. Both of those teams saying no and the Twins being the ones to say yes, even with still language written in based on player time, plate appearances, to be exact. I think it's just, you got to be honest here. Like, this is not a good long-term situation.
Yeah, when you look at the Twins, I think it's one of those things that it's tough to get a star to want to come to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Like, no offense to Minnesota, like, it's tough to convince people to go there. Like, if they draft them and develop them themselves, like they did with Joe Mauer and Justin Morneau and Byron Buxton and these guys, like, different conversation. But they had to convince Correa. So does that mean they turn a little bit of a blind eye? I think that's apparent. And one thing I think that's telling too is when this Mets deal was falling apart, we only heard about the Twins coming through. Like, so where were the Red Sox? Where were the Dodgers? Where were the Yankees? Where were
Let me read the next question, because I do want to hear from you on this. I thought this was a great question to ask. This is from Jackie. Honestly, if the Mets felt the need to want yearly physicals for just a 6-year deal, it's got to be bad. And if that's the case, I'm okay with not signing him. Because you have to wonder at 6 years, why did the Dodgers or Red Sox never jump in?
It's a good question, right? I know the Dodgers are saving money, but at the same time, they're much in the vein of the Mets, that they are willing to be opportunistic on things and pounce on things. And if they saw this as a value play, they probably would have done that. And we saw what's happening with the Red Sox. Trevor Story underwent a surgery to his elbow. He's going to be out 4 to 6 months. So they don't even have a shortstop right now. It's hard to envision that the Twins were the only team willing to do it. And I think that speaks volumes to the level of risk that they're taking. And, your points were really, really sound, especially the Giants, how motivated they were just to make a splash. And they were so afraid of this physical that they forewent a splash and signed Conforto and
took a PR hit.
Mitch Haniger, and a big PR hit. And the Mets, it's a little less of a PR hit because of how much action they've done. Like it's almost like we just completely forget and throw in our pocket that they signed Verlander, they signed Kodai Senga, they kept Edwin Diaz, they kept Brandon Nimmo, they brought in David Robertson, they made all these moves, and Correa was kind of like the icing on the top of the cake. And I'll tell you, I'm not a huge sweet person in general, but I very much prefer the icing over the cake in general. And so, like, I understand why that was tough for them. But yeah, it's definitely a great question. Why weren't more teams involved? And I would really like to see, as time goes on, hopefully some more reporting on that.
And it's Scott Boras. So there's no lack of effort. I mean, right. This is somebody that can get teams involved when they weren't even sure they were going to be involved on players. And, you know, one last note of why the Twins here, why are they willing to take this kind of risk? The Twins have not finished. They finished under 500 the last 2 years in a division that, if you're in that division, I don't care if you have a $20 million payroll, you always have a chance. You always have a chance. The Guardians have figured out a way to win that division without spending. The rest of the division is abysmal. I mean, even last year, the second place team finished 81-81. Yeah. That's crazy, dude, when you look at the situation compared to the Mets.
Yeah, it's an easier division to win. So, you know, good for the Twins. They got to keep Carlos Correa. And, you know, obviously I hope he's healthy and good. I don't wish bad things on him. It's a unfortunate circumstance. Like, it's a tough time for him. I know it's hard to feel bad for these guys that are pulling in $30 million a year, but imagine having your family flown across the country for a press conference. You go house shopping the day before. The whole family is dressed up in their suits and dresses and everything they're wearing for the press conference. And 2 hours before, they say no. And obviously that's a downer. And then 12 hours later, your agent goes, "Don't worry about it, Carlos. We're good. We got 12,315 from the Mets." And then that falls through too. And now he has a contract that, you know, like you said, it guarantees $200 million. So no one's going to feel too bad for him. But man, he has a lot to prove, and he potentially lost, you know, north of $100 million because of this ankle.
All right, the last question here. This is kind of looking at the other side of things. It's from Mikey, who said, so I get why the Mets didn't want to guarantee the last 6 years of the contract, but why couldn't they just match what the Twins offered? The Twins gave him 6 years. 6 years from the Mets, even with a high AAV, sounds like a good deal for the Mets to me.
I mean, it fits closer to their mold of what they want to do, because that's another thing that we haven't really touched on. What they did with Correa was just like a complete outlier from what they're trying to do systemically. Is that the word? Yeah, I think that's the word. That's what I'm going to go with. Like that, their idea is short-term, big AAV. So like that's ultimately what they want to do. So in a vacuum, yeah, why would they let the Twins outbid them by $6 million a year, basically the cost of a Brooks Raley? Like, why would you let that happen? I think that is so telling as to how bad this physical was in the Mets doctor's point of view. And, you know, we talked about it earlier, how each year he had to pass a physical, supposedly was like part of the deal. And if that's the case, they must have literally looked at his physical and said, I don't know how healthy this guy's going to be in 2024, forget 2027, 2028. And if that's the case, then it's hard to say, like, yeah, they should have just went for it. I mean, Steve Cohen's willing to eat some money. We know that, but is he willing to eat $100 million? I think he'd definitely prefer to not do that.
I think so too. I think it's just a matter of, there's a lot of information here that we don't know the specifics of. And one side will look really smart and one side will look really foolish, or it'll fall exactly in the middle where Correa is exactly the player he's been since he came up to the big leagues for the next 5 years. Yeah. And then everything starts to significantly trend the wrong way. And let's not forget here, Joe, this is a guy that is 28. He's playing this season as a 28-year-old. He hit free agency as a 27-year-old because he got
It's the best time of your life. Yeah, best case to hit free agency, other than Juan Soto, who's going to be like an anomaly and like he's going to be like 25 or whatever when he hits free agency. But like 27, 28, that's like, boom, you're getting that 12, 13-year deal. You're getting that huge money. And obviously it didn't quite work out for him in that light. But yeah, it's crazy how this has turned out. And, I don't envision us seeing something like this anytime soon.
I don't think so either. But you know what? It's over. The saga has ended. And with that, Joe, I ask you your closing thoughts for our latest episode of the Mets Pod.
It's a disappointing day. Obviously, we all wanted to see Carlos Correa in the lineup, but take some solace in the fact that the Mets are willing to stay firm on their doctors' opinions, on their baseball people's opinions. Steve Cohen is going to spend on this team. This $300 million that he had kind of set for Correa will get spent one way or another somewhere. He's fully committed to trying to win with this team. They made what they thought was the logical decision. And, like we said, time will tell if they were right or wrong. But I do, to a degree, commend their efforts on, they are trying to go all in. And, now there's probably just not that piece available to really make them go all in. But it's where the Mets are headed. They're going to be trying to win year in and year out, and they're always going to be focused on winning for the long term. So bit of a bummer of a day to have to talk about this as Correa not being a Met, but let's not forget they won 101 games. I don't need to repeat all that stuff. They won 101. The offense was fifth in runs scored. The pitching staff, I would say I prefer this year's pitching staff to last year's pitching staff. And, we're going to see how it goes, but we're getting close to actual baseball. So as much as we love the offseason, I feel like after this 3-week run with Carlos Correa, I'm ready for this offseason hot stove to just end. Just bring me to Port St. Lucie, bring me to spring training. Let's see guys playing baseball, and then let's just see how the chips fall.
I'm with you all the way. There's a lot to be excited about with this team. There's a lot of new faces. A lot of important old faces are back with the team. This team won over 100 games last year. I also think they have a move or two left in them before we ultimately get to spring training. So a lot to cover. We will be with you again next week and going forward for the rest of the year. So a reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.